Some mornings, the silence in a house is just quiet. And some mornings, it's a verdict. The morning the envelope arrived, I was standing at the kitchen counter in my bathrobe, waiting for the coffee to finish. The kind of ordinary moment that has no idea what's about to walk through the front door. My name is Dorothy Calloway. I'm 64 years old. And 6 months after my husband Leonard died, I was handed a lawsuit by a man in a rumpled suit who couldn't make eye contact. The name on the filing was my stepson, Garrett. I sat down right there on the kitchen floor, not because my legs gave out, but because I needed a moment to feel the full weight of what I was holding before I decided what to do with it. The documents accused me of manipulation, isolation, predatory marriage. They described me as a woman with no formal education beyond a community college certificate. No career, no independent income, and no legitimate claim to Leonard Calloway's estate. They called me a dependent. They called me a schemer. And they called the 22 years I spent loving that man a con. The estate was valued at just under $9 million. A manufacturing business Leonard had built from a single warehouse in Dayton, Ohio, real estate across 3 counties, retirement accounts, life insurance, and a small vineyard in Virginia that we'd bought together on our 10th anniversary because Leonard said the land reminded him of his grandmother's garden. Garrett wanted all of it. And he'd hired the lawyer to prove he deserved it. His name was Marcus Holt. 42 years old, 12 years as a senior partner at Bellamy & Holt, the most aggressive civil litigation firm in the region. He'd won inheritance disputes worth far more than Leonard's estate. He was charming, precise, and ruthless in the way that only people who've never lost can be. He was also, as it turned out, about to make the worst miscalculation of his professional life. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to the beginning. The real beginning. I was born Dorothy Ann Pruitt in Lexington, Kentucky. My father was a high school history teacher. My mother taught piano lessons in the living room every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon. We weren't poor, but we understood the difference between a want and a need before most children learn to read. I was sharp. Everyone said so. Sharp enough that my sophomore English teacher pulled me aside after class and told me I argued better than most of the law students she'd tutored at night. So I went to law school. University of Kentucky College of Law. Then a clerkship with a federal appellate judge in Cincinnati. Then 7 years as an assistant district attorney in Hamilton County, where I tried over 40 felony cases and lost 3. By the time I was 36, I'd been appointed to a position most attorneys spend their whole careers chasing. I became a senior mediator and arbitration judge for the Ohio Commercial Disputes Division, handling multi-million-dollar corporate conflicts, contract breaches, estate litigation. I was known for 2 things: absolute fairness, and absolutely no patience for nonsense. Then I met Leonard Calloway at a charity auction for a children's hospital in Columbus. He was bidding on a painting he openly admitted he didn't understand. He said he just liked that it reminded him of a road he used to drive to visit his mother. I bid against him. He laughed. We ended up splitting the cost and arguing for 45 minutes over where to hang it. And that was that. Leonard had lost his first wife, Carol, to a sudden illness 5 years earlier. He was raising Garrett alone, a 16-year-old boy who wore his grief like a coat of armor and had learned to use silence as a weapon. I understood him. I'd grown up around people who carried pain they didn't know how to put down. We married 18 months after that auction. And I made a choice. Looking back now, I understand it differently than I did then. At the time, it felt like love. It felt like freedom. The freedom to stop performing excellence for an audience and just live. Leonard needed a partner, not a career woman tracking billable hours. Garrett needed stability, not a stepmother distracted by depositions. So I stepped away. I maintained my bar license, quietly, dutifully, completing continuing education requirements every year out of habit more than intention. But I didn't practice. I didn't advertise. I became Dorothy Calloway, Leonard's wife, Garrett's stepmother, the woman who kept the house running and the family breathing. Garrett never forgave me for not being his mother. I understood that, too. He was 16. He wanted his mother back and instead got a woman who rearranged the kitchen and had opinions about his homework. I never pushed him. I never demanded affection he didn't have to give. I just showed up, year after year, consistent as the seasons. It wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough for Garrett. The years passed. Garrett moved to Atlanta for work. Came back for Christmas when it suited him. Called his father on birthdays if he remembered. I watched Leonard wait by the phone with a patience that broke my heart a little more each time. When Leonard's heart condition was diagnosed 3 years ago, Garrett flew in for one weekend, declared himself informed, and flew back out. I stayed. I drove Leonard to every cardiologist appointment. I learned the names of his medications, the interaction risks, the dietary restrictions. I sat in hospital waiting rooms with bad coffee and worse chairs, and I was there. Every single time, when he woke up. Leonard knew what that cost me. He told me so, near the end. The courthouse in Dayton smelled like lemon cleaner and old carpet. I walked in wearing a gray wool blazer over a simple black dress, nothing dramatic. Nothing that announced itself. I was still deciding how much of myself to reveal and when. Garrett was already seated at the plaintiff's table, 42 years old, wearing a navy suit that cost more than most people's car payments. His dark hair neatly trimmed. He looked confident. He looked, if I'm being honest, like his father, before his father learned what mattered. Marcus Holt sat beside him, immaculate, reviewing notes with the bored precision of a surgeon prepping for a routine procedure. He didn't look at me when I entered. That would change. The presiding judge was the Honorable Patricia Okafor, mid-50s, natural hair pinned back, reading glasses perched at the end of her nose. I'd done my research the night before. Harvard Law, former county prosecutor, appointed to the bench 9 years ago. Known for sharp questioning and zero tolerance for procedural theater. In other words, my kind of judge. Marcus Holt opened with a performance. There's no other word for it. He walked the courtroom through his version of my marriage with the practiced grief of a man who'd rehearsed it until it felt real. He painted Leonard as a lonely widower, emotionally vulnerable after Carol's death, isolated from his only son by a calculating woman who'd identified him as a target. He used the word vulnerable 4 times in 6 minutes. He used the word isolated 3 times. And then he turned toward me, and with the full confidence of a man who'd never been surprised in a courtroom. He said, "Mrs. Calloway has no professional background, no independent financial identity, and no expertise that would qualify her to manage an estate of this complexity. She is, by every practical measure, a retired homemaker who has spent the last 22 years entirely dependent on my client's father for her survival." Garrett laughed. Quietly, to himself, but I heard it. And something in my chest, something that had been very patient for a very long time, stopped being patient. Judge Okafor looked at me over her glasses. "Mrs. Calloway, do you have representation?" "I'm representing myself, Your Honor." A brief pause. "Are you comfortable proceeding on that basis?" "Yes, Your Honor," Quite comfortable. Holt called his first witness, Garrett's childhood friend, a man named Dennis who'd visited the house twice in 20 years and was now prepared to testify that I'd seemed controlling during a Thanksgiving dinner he attended in 2019. I let Holt finish his direct examination. Then I stood. "Dennis," I said, "you testified that I seemed to be managing the conversation during Thanksgiving dinner. Is that correct?" "Yes." Leonard had experienced 2 cardiac episodes in the 6 weeks prior to that dinner. Are you aware of that? Dennis blinked. No. His cardiologist had specifically instructed me to prevent him from becoming overstressed or emotionally agitated. Were you aware of that? No. So when you observed me gently redirecting certain topics at the dinner table, you interpreted that as controlling behavior rather than medical management of a man whose heart was in a fragile condition. Holt stood. Objection. Counsel is. I'll rephrase. I said, "Dennis, is it possible that what you witnessed was a wife protecting her husband's health rather than isolating her stepson?" Dennis looked at his hands. "I guess it's possible." No further questions. I could feel the temperature in the room shift. Holt felt it too. He was good enough to recognize the moment when a case begins to turn. And I watched him recalibrate, shuffling his notes, tightening his jaw slightly. But he still didn't know who he was dealing with. At the lunch recess, I was gathering my files when Judge Okafor's clerk approached me quietly. "Judge Okafor would like to speak with you briefly in chambers. Mrs. Calloway." I followed her through the side door. Patricia Okafor was standing at her window when I entered, looking out at the parking lot below. She turned when I came in, and her expression was one I'd worn myself many times, the controlled neutrality of someone sitting on a significant piece of information. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, "I want to ask you something directly, and I'd appreciate a direct answer." "Of course, Your Honor." "Are you Dorothy Pruitt Calloway, formerly of the Ohio Commercial Disputes Division?" The question hung in the air between us like a held breath. "Yes, Your Honor," I said, "I am." She nodded slowly, set down the pen she'd been holding. "I clerked for Judge Abramowitz the year you handled the Meridian Steel arbitration. I was 26 years old. I watched you dismantle a legal team of 8 in 3 days." She paused. "It was the reason I decided to pursue the bench." I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. "I'm going to ask you formally, on the record this afternoon, whether you have any professional legal background," she said. "I expect you to answer truthfully." "I will, Your Honor." She looked at me for a long moment. "Mr. Holt has no idea, does he?" It wasn't quite a question. "No," I said, "he doesn't." She turned back to the window. "Court reconvenes at 2 o'clock. I walked back into that courtroom after lunch a different woman than the one who'd walked out. Not different inside, I'd always been her. But I was done hiding her. Judge Okafor settled into her chair and looked at me directly. "Mrs. Calloway, for the record, can you please state your full professional background for the court?" Holt looked up from his notes, mildly curious. Garrett was checking his phone. "My name is Dorothy Ann Calloway," I said. "I hold a Juris Doctor from the University of Kentucky College of Law. Graduated summa cum laude. I served as a law clerk to the Honorable Raymond Chu on the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. I spent 7 years as an assistant district attorney in Hamilton County, with a trial record of 40 wins and 3 losses in felony proceedings. And for 11 years, I served as a senior mediator and arbitration judge for the Ohio Commercial Disputes Division, where I presided over cases totaling more than $400 million in contested assets. The sound that came from Marcus Holt's table was not quite a gasp. It was the sound a man makes when the floor disappears beneath him. His pen hit the table. He stood up, not on purpose. His body just responded before his mind could stop it. His chair scraped back. Every eye in the courtroom went to him. And then he looked at me. Really looked at me. And I watched the color drain completely from his face. "Mr. Holt," Judge Okafor said, her voice perfectly even, "is everything all right?" He sat down slowly. "Your Honor, we were not aware of, our background investigation did not." "Your background investigation," I said calmly, "searched for Dorothy Calloway. My professional work was conducted under Dorothy Pruitt. I took my husband's name when we married. That's not concealment, Mr. Holt. That's just a woman's legal right." Garrett had finally put his phone down. He was staring at me like he'd never seen me before. Which, I supposed, he hadn't. What followed that afternoon was not so much a legal battle as a systematic, methodical dismantling. Holt put Garrett on the stand. I cross-examined him with the patience of someone who had nothing left to prove and nowhere else to be. "Garrett," I said, "you've testified that I limited your access to your father. Can you tell me the last time you visited before his diagnosis?" He shifted. "We talked regularly." I asked about visits. "In person." "I was living in Atlanta. It was a long trip." "It's a 2-hour flight." "Garrett, your father offered to pay for it 11 times in the 3 years before his diagnosis. I have his emails." I held up a folder. "Would you like me to read them aloud?" Holt objected. I withdrew and moved on. "During the week your father was discharged from the hospital after his second cardiac event, do you recall that week?" Garrett looked at the table. "I was in the middle of a work project." "You were at a professional golf tournament in Scottsdale. I have your social media posts." I paused. "Your father asked me not to tell you that he noticed. He didn't want you to feel guilty." Another pause. "I'm telling you now because this court deserves the truth." The jury was very still. Garrett's jaw was working like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. "One final question," I said. "In 22 years, Garrett, did I ever tell you that you weren't welcome in your father's home?" A long silence. "No." "Did I ever refuse to cook for you when you visited?" "No." "Did I ever ask your father to stop calling you? Stop reaching out? Stop hoping?" His voice was barely audible. "No." "Then where," I said quietly, "did the isolation happen, Garrett?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. I presented Leonard's personal letters next. Handwritten, dated, notarized by his attorney at his explicit request 2 years before his death. Leonard had been thorough in ways even I hadn't fully understood until that night in his study. When I'd opened the locked mahogany box he'd always called his peace of mind drawer. The letters were addressed to the court. Not to me, not to Garrett, to whoever might one day need to understand. Judge Okafor read them silently first. Then, at my request, they were entered into evidence and the clerk read several passages aloud. Leonard's voice, in that courtroom, was unmistakable. He wrote about the years he'd watched me quietly keep our family alive. The medical appointments, the 3 a.m. hospital drives, the Thanksgiving dinners I made from scratch even when Garrett didn't show up until dessert and left before coffee. He wrote about the vineyard in Virginia, how it had been my idea. How I'd spent 6 months researching soil conditions and irrigation before I mentioned it to him. Because I wanted it to succeed. He wrote about knowing who I used to be. He'd known for years. He'd found an old legal journal with my name in it. He said, he'd never mentioned it because he wanted me to reclaim it in my own time. On my own terms. Dorothy gave up a legacy. Leonard had written, so that our family could have one. I want this court to understand that every decision in my will was made with full knowledge of that sacrifice. Full appreciation for her devotion. And full confidence that she is the most capable person I have ever known. Garrett is my son and I love him. But Dorothy is my partner. And she has earned every single thing I am leaving her. The courtroom was silent for a long moment after the clerk finished reading. Judge Okafor removed her reading glasses and set them on her desk. She looked at Marcus Holt. He was already shaking his head slowly, the legal pad in front of him bare and untouched. "Mr. Holt," she said, "do you wish to continue?" He stood, straightened his jacket, and said something I suspect he had never said in a courtroom before. "Your Honor, on behalf of the plaintiff, we withdraw all claims and stipulate to the validity of the will in its entirety." He turned to me. And he said, quietly enough that only I could hear, "Mrs. Calloway, I owe you an apology." I looked at him steadily. "You owe me nothing. Mr. Holt, you were doing your job. You just didn't have all the facts." A beat. "Neither did I," he said. "About who I was up against." Judge Okafor ruled in my favor on all counts. She also noted, for the record, that the allegations brought against me had caused documented reputational harm, and that should I choose to pursue remedies for that harm, the court's findings would support such action. I thanked her. I didn't pursue the remedies. I didn't need to. Garrett was waiting on the courthouse steps when I came out. He looked hollowed out, like a person who'd spent years building a story about themselves and had just watched it collapse in an afternoon. "I didn't know," he said, "about any of it, who you were, what you gave up, I didn't know." "I know you didn't." He looked at the ground. "That doesn't make it okay." "No," I agreed, "it doesn't." We stood there for a moment in the thin November light. Two people with 22 years of history between them and almost none of it shared the right way. "He talked about you," Garrett said finally. "In the end, when I came that last week." He paused. "He said you were the reason he wasn't afraid." I felt the tears come and I let them. "I'm sorry I wasn't there more," Garrett said. "I'm sorry I made it harder than it needed to be. I'm sorry I stood in that courtroom and laughed." I looked at my stepson, this man I'd tried to love for 22 years through every wall he'd ever built, and I said the thing I'd needed to say for longer than I could remember. "Garrett, your father never stopped loving you. Not once. Not even when you made it very difficult to like you." He laughed, a short, wet, surprised sound. "That sounds like him." "It does," I said. "He said it to me about you. Almost exactly. About 6 months before he died." We didn't hug. We weren't there yet. But we walked to our separate cars without animosity for the first time in 22 years. And that, I thought, was a beginning. 3 months after the trial, I reopened my legal practice. Not in a grand office downtown. In a converted sunroom at the back of the house. With Leonard's law books on the shelves and a coffee maker that ran all day and a waiting list that grew faster than I expected. Word travels in the legal community. Especially when the word is that Dorothy Pruitt Calloway is back. My first 3 clients were all women over 60. All widows. All fighting stepchildren or distant relatives for estates their husbands had intended for them. All of them had been told, in one way or another, that they were just housewives. That they didn't understand. That they should let the professionals handle it. I won all 3 cases. On a Tuesday morning in February, I was reviewing discovery documents when my phone buzzed with a text from Garrett. Can I come for dinner sometime? No agenda. I just want to see the house. I sat with that message for a full minute. Then I typed back, Saturday. 6 o'clock. I'll make the pot roast your father always asked for. 3 dots appeared. Then, he told me about that pot roast. Said it was the best thing he'd ever eaten. I smiled at my phone. Set it down. Went back to my documents. Looking back now, I think about what it cost me to become who Leonard needed me to be. And I don't regret it. Not the years. Not the career. Not any of it. But I also think about the woman who sat on her kitchen floor with a lawsuit in her hands. Who'd almost forgotten what she was capable of. Here's the thing about being underestimated. It only works if you agree with it. Garrett came to dinner that Saturday. And the Saturday after that. We're careful with each other. Deliberate. We're learning each other slowly. The way you learn a language you should have been taught years ago but weren't. It's not perfect. It probably never will be. But Leonard would have been glad. And honestly, so am I. Now I want to hear from you. If you were in my place, what would you have done? Have you ever been dismissed as something less than you were? Leave your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story has reached. And stay right there, because I've left 2 more stories on the final screen that I think you're really going to want to hear.